Fine, but I'm really am David Crystal, and you mentioned the book. Yes, here it is. It's just came out this week, a couple of days ago, and as the gentleman himself. And my story in relation to Tyndale goes back a long, long way. Yes, as you mentioned, I'm a linguist. I'm a historian of the English language amongst that's my main always been my main interest really, going back to the 1960s, I guess. And when I first started to write on the history of English and all the people who were involved in it, William Tyndale was there right from the very beginning, but only a paragraph or two in a study. He was there, but not a dominant figure as he's come to be much later. And I've always had a reference to him in anything I've written on the history of the language. But it's only in the last, 20 years that I've come to really appreciate his enormous significance in relation to that history of the language, over and above the the familiar side of him to all of you in relation to his translation. And it's always surprised me how angles on him come in from different directions, really. And the topic I want to talk to you about this evening is, this evening for me, afternoon for you, perhaps morning for some others. Who knows who's coming in at what time of day here? What I want to talk to you about is the sound of Tyndale as reconstructed in what we call these days original pronunciation. OP for short, much easier. Original pronunciation, too many syllables. OP, original pronunciation. Now, this is all part of a general movement that began in the 19th century, actually, when people were first starting to reconstruct the history of language and languages and going as far back as they could and wanting to know how they sounded. It was a subject called philology, comparative philology in those days. And some of the first attempts to do this in relation to English were in relation to Chaucer, for instance, or Anglo-Saxon, or Shakespeare. Many studies in the 19th century. And then in the 20th century, this built up when linguistics came along and became a subject. That whole area was revisited and rethought in terms of the developments that had taken place in the 20th century, such as, for example, the development of the phonetic alphabet and things like that. And so I was slightly surprised to find that this area of reconstructing earlier sound systems, technically called historical phonology, fascinating to me and to, I suppose, a small number of linguists around the world. I never thought for one moment it was ever going to be useful to anybody, that people outside of my narrow cell would actually want to know about this field. But that's what happened back in the 1990s, really, and into the early 2000s. It started with reference to Shakespeare. In 2004, Shakespeare's Globe, the reconstruction of the original Shakespeare's Globe theatre in the 1500s, late 1500s, 1599, it was rebuilt insofar as they were able to replicate it on the south bank of the Thames, just opposite St. Paul's Cathedral. And you may have seen it, you may have been there. And the aim of the Globe, the reconstructed Globe, it opened in 1997, was to introduce original practices as best they could. So they would have original costume, original music on original instruments. The theatre itself had an original shape, and so the actors had to move on the stage in an original way. big pillars, for example, that you had to move carefully around in order to be seen by the audience. But they'd never tried original pronunciation. That is, to reconstruct the sounds of Shakespeare as it would have been heard in those days, as they would have been heard in those days. And then in 2004, they decided to dip their toe into that water. And they had a production of Romeo and Juliet in original pronunciation. They phoned me up one day. This is the point. It was completely out of the blue. Phoned me up and said, David, we're going to do this show in original pronunciation. Can you help? And so suddenly I found all my old philological thoughts and all that historical linguistics suddenly becoming real and not just an academic exercise. And I worked with the company and we did a production of Romeo and Juliet in original pronunciation. And it went down a treat. It really did. People absolutely loved it. They felt, closer to Shakespeare than ever before. So the beginning of Romeo and Juliet, you'll remember it. Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene, from ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. That's my modern British accent. Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene, from ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. And that kind of accent is one that, it would have been one of many accents at the time, of course, is the closest we can get to a reconstruction of the accent that would have been used at the time. And I'll explain how you do that in just a little while. So that was one strand. Another strand had been an interest in Chaucer and wanting to hear Chaucer in his day. So the beginning of the Canterbury Tales, when that April with his sweet showers the draught of March hath pierced to the root. When that April with his shores sochte, the draught of March hath pierced to the rote, and bathed every vine in switch liqueur, of which virtue engendered is the flower. Engendered is the flower. And I mention Shakespeare and Chaucer because they are the two poles, if you like, in the middle of which is Tyndale. Tyndale's grandfather, as it were, could have spoken to Chaucer. Tyndale's grandson, if you'll forgive the allusion, could have spoken to Shakespeare. He's right in the middle in the early 1500s. So a reconstruction of Tyndale is going to be sort of halfway between the very difficult to understand When that April with his shores sochte, the draught of March hath pierced to the rote. What? What's all that about? If you study Chaucer, you need notes. But Shakespeare, two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene, that doesn't take too much strain to understand, does it? And one of the reasons, of course, is that there are several modern accents that are very close to that Shakespeare accent still, not just in this country, but in the United States as well, and in Canada too, and Australia, and South Africa. And so in reconstructing Tyndale, we are sort of elbowing our way into the middle of that period of very rapid sound change. In 200 years, you go from Chaucer to Shakespeare, and Tyndale's right in the middle. So how did the Tyndale approach come up? Well, another phone call. That's been my life, I'm sitting here minding my own business and the phone rings. Well, these days, of course, it's the email that drops into your inbox. And this time it was the British Library. And as you all well know, the British Library was planning to produce a facsimile edition of the New Testament. It came out in 2008, wasn't it? And they thought, because we're trying to reconstruct in a visual form as close as we can get to Tyndale, why don't we do the same thing for the accent of his time? So the guys who were at the British Library, they'd been to the Globe, they knew about the Shakespeare movement and the Chaucer movement, and they thought, let's try it for Tyndale. And so for it took nearly 2 weeks of recording time at the British Library. I spent, I'm not sure what adjective to use. It was both fascinating and frightening, I have to say, um, because I'd never explored that period before. It was new to me. And there's certain amounts of uncertainty about that period, which is not the case with the Chaucer or the Shakespeare. And it's not easy doing a reconstruction of this kind. If you know certain lines off by heart, as I do with the two examples I've given you from Chaucer and Shakespeare, no problem. But I didn't know Matthew's Bible off by heart. Does anybody? And so I had to really carefully work out line by line by line what the pronunciation might have been. And as you will know from the beginning of Matthew, it involves an awful lot of proper names. And of course, proper names are the devil of a job to try to reconstruct, because of course, as you know, with all names, people sometimes pronounce their names the way they want to pronounce them. And there isn't a sort of general rule that you can rely on. Nonetheless, after a couple of weeks, not, few hours every day, it wasn't sort of 24/7, I produced an audio version of the Matthew Gospel, which was made available on CD a couple of years later, 2000 and I've forgotten, 10, 11, something like that, and is still available. So I'll start my rendition with an example of how it sounds. You may have heard some of the bits of the CD, I don't know, but if you haven't, listen to this. So this is my best effort. And if you were doing it, what you're hearing, of course, is a reconstruction of the sound system of Tyndale spoken through my British accent. That's sort of superimposed on top. If you were doing it, you would superimpose your local accent. Remember, there are as many local accents in Tyndale's time as there are today in modern English. So you're hearing just one version here. And I've chosen this little extract from Matthew 8, simply because it has lots of examples of some of the differences. And I'm going to read it very, very slowly so that you can hear these differences clearly. It's the one when Jesus was entered into Capernaum. There came unto him a certain centurion, beseeching him and saying, Master, my servant lieth sick at home of the palsy, and is grievously pained. And Jesus said unto him, I will come and cure him. And so on. You'll remember the extract. When Jesus was entered into Capernaum, there came unto him a certain centurion, beseeching him, and saying, Master, my servant lieth sick at home of the palsy, and is grievously pained. And Jesus said unto him, I will come and cure him. The centurion answered and said, Sir, I am not worthy that thou shouldst come under my roof of my house, but spake the word only, and my servant shall be healed. For I also myself am a man under power, and have soldiers under me. And I say to one, Go, and he goeth, and to another, Come, and he cometh, and to me servant, Do this, and he doeth it. When Jesus heard these sayings, he marvelled, and said to them that followed him, Verily, I say unto you, I have not found so great faith, no, not in Israel. I say therefore unto you, that many shall come from the east and west, and shall rest with Abram, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. And the children of the kingdom shall be cast out into the utmost darkness, and shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And I stop there because that's my favorite line. Weeping and gnashing. The gnash is tremendous. Now, I've chosen that example because it contains so many instances of the differences between then and now. Though that silent G in gnashing of teeth, you see, was pronounced. So was the K in a word like no, kno. So was the W in a words like answer, answered, answered. They're silent now, those letters, but they weren't silent in those days, nor were they silent in Chaucer's time. They were lost during the 16th century. Shakespeare didn't use them, but Tyndale did. And that's one of the interesting features. And then there are lots of others. Probably the most noticeable one to British ears and to other parts of the English-speaking world, but not necessarily in the United States, unless you're from New England or somewhere, is the R that's pronounced after the vowels. Master, and so on. Well, that's old news to you, to most of you. But of course, in British English, it died out, that final R in standard, received pronunciation, the voice of the BBC, although it's still very strong in some regional accents in Britain. But all R's were pronounced in English, in all varieties of English until the 18th century. And so it's a very important feature of the style here. And then we've got, oops, just put my paper on the floor. And then we've got some old pronunciations that are sometimes echoed in modern English and most usually not. All the words ending in T-I-O-N or S-I-O-N, conversation, temptation, conversation, temptation, conversation, musician. That's how they were pronounced in those days, and still are in some versions. I mean, if you listen to evensong sometimes, in some traditions, salvation is still sung, but salvation, of course, in modern English. You'll perhaps have noticed the L pronounced, another silent letter, in words like would and should and could, would and should and could. That was that in those days. You'll have noticed perhaps the pronunciation of the U vowel, as in cum and unto, not come and unto, or cam and I mean, there are all sorts of modern unrounded sounds for that vowel. But in those days, it was very much a rounded vowel, cum, and unto, that sort of sound. Still heard, of course, in modern English up in the north of England, where they still say cum, just like Tyndale would have done. Northern ploughboys would have understood him perfectly. And then you will have noticed the sound of E, which wasn't that modern sound, as in Jesus, Jesus and words like that. Jesus, Jesus, J. Yeah, the E sound didn't emerge until much, much later. Jesus. And that's still heard today, of course, especially in places like Ireland. I'll be Jesus. They still say it like that there. You'll have noticed the H pronounced, perhaps. When Jesus was entered into Capernaum. When, not when. In his day, there would have been a contrast between Wales, where I live now and where I'm speaking to you from, and whales, the things that live in the sea. Whales. Today, of course, whales and whales. Am I talking about the fish, the sea animal, or am I talking about the country? You can't tell the difference. But in those days, all those H's were pronounced. And then, did you notice the G pronounced at the ends of some verbs, like weeping and gnashing? That pronounced there. It's another important feature. And so on and so forth. I mean, we can talk about individual words later if you like, but the overall effect is clearly very, very different from anything you might have heard later or earlier. The question that comes into everybody's minds, of course, as soon as they hear some examples of original pronunciation is, how do you know? How do you do this sort of thing? What's the evidence? And there are four kinds of evidence that people look for when they're reconstructing an earlier period of pronunciation. The first evidence, and the most important one as far as Tyndale is concerned, is the spelling. Spelling today is no guide to pronunciation, as we all know. We all had to learn English spelling in school, and we all remember what a pain it was, and sometimes still is. But in Chaucer's time, spelling was not standardized. Spelling, people spelt as they spoke. So if they sounded a sound, down it would be spelt when they wrote it. And by Tyndale's time, that attitude of spell as you speak was still a very dominant feature of the scene. It was beginning to change. In the 16th century, it became a dominant change. By the end of the 16th century, people were already worrying about English spelling. The reform movements in English spelling began during the 16th century. But at the beginning of the century, and certainly when Tyndale was growing up as a lad, no, people would still spell more or less as they spoke. There were some regional accent differences, of course. That's one of the problems you have to cope with. But on the whole, you can trust the spelling to be a guide to how the words would have been pronounced. And that's the first kind of evidence. The second kind of evidence is the rhymes that people use. Any of you who've studied Chaucer will know that there are lots and lots of cases in Chaucer where words rhyme, but they don't seem to rhyme anymore. So in Chaucer, for instance, a word like was rhymes with a word like glass. It must have been was and glass. A word like worn rhymes with a word like barn. Warn and barn, it would have been. A word like one rhymes with a word like bone. It has to be own and bone. And the same point applies to Shakespeare. There are lots of rhymes in Shakespeare that simply don't work in modern English. You know, Shakespeare's sonnets, all 154 of them, 96 of them have couplets that don't rhyme in modern English. So what's the conclusion? Either Shakespeare was a lousy poet, didn't know how to rhyme properly, or the pronunciation has changed. And that's, of course, what's happened. So rhyming is very important. And a lot of the evidence for the sound system of Tyndale's time comes from the fact that in the previous century, there were so many poets that wrote rhyming couplets. And Chaucer, of course, is a case in point. Tyndale himself, I don't think, wrote any poems, did he? No, not sure. Haven't come across any. But if he had, then certainly there'd be some interesting rhymes there. So rhyming is the second kind of evidence. And the third kind of evidence, which is not quite so important for our talk today, is that often there are puns that don't work in modern English, that do work in Shakespeare's time, Shakespeare puns all the time, and that's a big source of evidence for him, but not so much for Tyndale. And then the fourth kind of evidence, which is very important, is that people actually wrote books on pronunciation and how people spoke in those days. Not in the early 15th century, but in the later 15th century, 16th century. By the end of the century, people had already begun to write books on reforming English spelling, as I mentioned earlier. And some of those, if you're going to write a book about spelling, you've got to write about pronunciation at the same time. And so that's where we get lots of guidelines. Somebody saying, this is how we pronounce this word. This is how we pronounce that word. Don't pronounce this word with a sounded vowel or consonant, whatever it might be. Put the stress on this syllable of this, all of this sort of thing starts to emerge in the writing of people over that period of time. Put all this sort of information together, plus a general sense and knowledge of how sounds change in time, which is what historical phonology is all about. And you get a reconstruction that can never be 100% perfect, but is as close as we can get. If I had to put a figure on it, I'd say maybe that what you heard in Tyndale there was something like 80%, maybe a bit more. I might go to 90% after a drink or two, but of course, it's a long way from 100. There's always going to be some uncertainty, some choices that have to be made. And when I was doing the recording for the British Library, I had to make those choices quite a lot. Two alternatives here. Which one shall I go for? I'm going to go for this one. You might go the other way. So there'll always be a little bit of uncertainty about it. But still, the reconstruction is, as you heard it a little while ago. So how do you know? That's how we know. When people hear it for the first time, their immediate reaction, at least for people in Britain who are more, where the accents are still much more immediately varied than in the United States, shall we say. There's a significant accent change in Britain every 50 miles or so. It really is a very diverse accent community. It's retained its accent variation much more than in the States or Canada or Australia, New Zealand or South Africa and the other big English-speaking parts of the world. When people hear it for the first time, they say, hey, we speak like that where we come from. Wherever they come from, they say that. And the reason they say that is because they're so used to hearing Shakespeare or the Bible in a BBC kind of accent. Yes, that's the voice of the stage in Britain, was since the 19th century. That's how you hear Shakespeare all the time, in that rather elegant Southern British, speak like the Queen, speak like the King, speak like the BBC sort of accent. It's not the accent I have. My accent is a mix of Northern England, I was in Liverpool for many years, and Wales, where I am now. But no, I can switch into an accent like the Southern British one, if you like, and speak for a few seconds in that kind of accent. And I now sound absolutely authoritative, don't I? Now you'll believe everything I say simply because the accent I'm using has that kind of authoritative ring about it. Well, it's certainly the voice of upper class Britain, but it's not the voice of the 90% of the population of Britain. And so when people hear an older accent like the Shakespearean one or the Tyndale one, it sounds more like their local accent. And they say, we speak like that way where we come from. So people from the north of England will log on to those cums and say, hey, yes, that's our accent. And people from the west of England will listen to those R's and say, ooh, R, that's our accent. And they don't hear everything, of course. They hear just the little bits they want to hear. So regardless of where your ploughboy would come from, from the north, from the south, from the west, from the east, but not from the BBC. Listening to the Tyndale accent would immediately give him a sense of recognition that I'm afraid has been largely lost today because of the way these texts are typically presented to us. And so I hope that reconstructing the Tyndale voice in this way will add an extra dimension to this whole business of speaking to ploughboys. Or as Tyndale himself says in The Obedience of a Christian Man, 1528, when he quotes Moses' call to Israel to hear his words. And this is what he says, remember? I want to talk to them as thou sittest in thine house and as thou walkest by the way. That's how he thinks of his own speech, or how he wants his speech to come across. That somebody sitting in their house or walking along the way these days with earbuds in their ears would be able to hear his words and identify with them because the accent doesn't distance them from what it is he was trying to say. And that was the motivation, I suspect, behind the British Library request to do the pronunciation in that way. And that was certainly my motivation when I tried to fulfill their request. And so there we are. There's half an hour of general chat about it, and we can talk a little bit further and fill in some gaps, or we can talk about the book as well, and indeed anything you like. Thank you very much, Marilyn.
Thank you. Thank you. That's definitely food for thought. And I know that we'll have a lot of discussion. And I will start off by asking you a question, and then everybody can fill in. And my question is this. When Tyndale went to do his translation, obviously he's working from the ancient texts and very concerned about meaning and all that. But are you saying that he adjusted language patterns to suit the plowboy of Gloucestershire, or what? I mean, who was he aimed? I mean, the plowboy is a pretty general term. Obviously, he's concerned about England, but there's so many varieties that you've mentioned. How does the concern for addressing the common man accommodate such a range of possibilities?
Yes, not so much in the accent, I don't suppose, really at all. I mean, the ploughboy analogy is best illustrated with reference to vocabulary and to grammar to a certain extent in terms of sentence structure and so on, but very largely vocabulary. And so many of the idioms, this is what I talk about more in the book, so many of the idioms that have come down to us via the King James Bible, of course, go straight back to Tyndale, which is one of the big famous points about Tyndale, that he had so much influence on every 16th century translation. So I think the ploughboy allusion is more in relation to the lexicon rather than the phonology. That, I suppose, there's nothing really in the texts that I've read that point in a particular accent direction. The main thing that I think one should bear in mind is that the texts, that what he wrote was meant to be read quite quickly, not slowly. There is lots of evidence of, in the spellings, of shortening words, and being pronounced as an N, for instance, as in, bacon and eggs, not bacon and eggs, bacon and eggs, that sort of thing. There's lots of evidence in the spellings of a speeding up of the rendition of the text, just as in Shakespeare too. And so there are hints at pronunciation, but I don't really think that there's very much evidence going one way or the other as to how it would have been perceived by your British ploughboys.
Thank you.
Could you talk about your book a little bit?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, this again was not my idea. So many of my books are not my idea. They'll all come out of a publisher's lunch, usually, when you agree to anything. Um, it was a Bodleian this time, the Bodleian Library, who did the facsimile, another facsimile. And the director of the Bodleian Library Publishing, it's called, the publishing wing of the Bodleian Library, was well aware there was going to be a centenary coming up, and he felt that there was a need to symbolize that in some way. I don't know whether any other publishing houses have done this, but the Bod certainly wanted to do this, and so they asked for a re-evaluation of the language of Tyndale. And again, when I got the request, I thought, this is going, it's been done, surely. I look back at my own writing, and as I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, I'd written a few paragraphs here and there, and suddenly thought, this isn't good enough for a 500th anniversary. And I looked at all the other books that I have in my little library here on Tyndale, and people like David Daniel and all the others. And they say a huge amount about Tyndale, but actually relatively little on the nuts and bolts of his language. So I thought, right, okay, I'll begin at the beginning, as Dylan Thomas said, and see how I get on. So I did two things in this book. First of all, I wanted to check on just how many words and idioms had come into modern English as a result of Tyndale's writing. Everybody, all the textbooks I have, including my own, they all give a few examples here and there. But how many altogether? And I'd no idea. I would ask people that colleagues, and say, hey, how many new words and phrases do you think have come into English from Tyndale? And they'd say, oh, I don't know, a few dozen, I suppose. I don't know, 100? Oh, they'd no idea. Did you have any idea? People didn't, nor did I. So I went to the Oxford English Dictionary, which is the historical one, the online OED, which is the best guide to first recorded uses in English. That's the phrase, the first recorded use. The first time that you see a particular word or phrase written down. And I did the search. You can do it now. The online OED is wonderful in the sense that there's a digital search you can make. You click on first recorded uses, click on meanings, put in the name of the person you're interested in, and whoomph, up comes the result. And the result was 822 first recorded uses in the writing of Tyndale. I was bowled over by that figure, I have to say. I never guessed it was going to be so many. We're talking here about the entirety of Tyndale, of course, not just the translation. We're talking about all those many essays and commentaries and introductions and things. They'd all been read at some point or another by the assiduous lexicographers at the OED. And as a result, there was this amazing 822. So that formed the first, well, almost 2/3 of the book. To avoid boring lists, I grouped them into different themes. And so I hope those early chapters read reasonably smoothly. And that was the first task. But then the second task was, in a sense, even more important. Because over the last 20 or 30 years, a figure has grown into our collective consciousness. What proportion of the King James Bible is actually Tyndale? And the figure that came up in a study that was done a few years ago was 80%, 80%. Some people had said a bit more, some a bit less, but 80 was the figure that many people now quote without a second thought. They say, oh yes, 80% of the King James Bible is actually Tyndale. Well, true or false? It's never been linguistically investigated in the sense of a sophisticated analysis of all the language. And so that's what I tried to do in the second half of this book. I developed a special metric, a way of classifying similarity and difference between two texts. You see, at one extreme, there'll be a translation of a phrase or a word or a sentence from the Bible that has nothing whatsoever in common with what the King James Bible came up with. And then on the other hand, there'll be sentences that are absolutely identical, 100%. And then in between, there'll be sentences that are sort of 90% the same, or 80% the same, or 70% the same. How do you quantify that? And so that's what I did in the second half of the book. Without boring you with all the details, I ranked in quite a large sample, the same sample that had been done for the 80% figure some decade or so ago. I used the same sample and did a more sophisticated language analysis. And depending upon what you consider to be identical or near identical or not so near identical and so on, the figure I came up with was something nearer to 70%. Well, is that big news? 70%? It's still amazing, isn't it? Amazing. But it's a 70% more or less, because some people will say, well, that's a bit closer and that's not so close. And so, there's always room for debate about these things. But that's what happens in the second half of the book anyway. And the other big thing I found, which I was not expecting at all, was that Tyndale was really the first dictionary writer in English. What? Dictionary writer? He didn't write a dictionary? No, but he did something really special. What is a dictionary? It is a listing of the words of a language from A to Z, the alphabetical principle, A, B, C, D to Z. Oh, sorry, to Z. Must get my language right. Now, that principle was news in the 17th century. The first dictionary of English, according to all the textbooks, was written by a man called Richard Cordray in 1604. He called it a dictionary of hard words. And in his opening title page, he says, "Dear reader, this is a listing of hard words in English, and I have organized them alphabetically. Let me explain what I mean by that. If the word begins with letter A, you will find it at the beginning. If the word and he explains what the alphabetical principle is in 1604. Nobody had done that in English before, according to all the textbooks I've ever read on the history of English, including my own. But you go into Tyndale, and at the end of several of his commentaries, 3 of his big commentaries, he lists a number of difficult words that he wants to explain to his reader, and they're organized A to Z. He is the first person I've ever read to try to organize words in an alphabetical way. And that was the thing basis of the little article I sent to you, Neil, because I thought this is so unexpected. And Tyndale is the first, primitive infant lexicographer. That was perhaps one of the biggest surprises that I had in doing this exercise.
Yes, I noticed that at the end of each book of his Pentateuch, he has a list of difficult words in that book with an explanation.
Yeah.
And at first I wondered why he didn't do one at the end of the Pentateuch. And then I realized that each book had been produced so that they could either be sold separately or put together. And so that's why each book has a separate glossary.
Right.
But really interesting what you say. I hadn't thought about. That's actually the first recorded case of that ever happening.
Yeah.
And so that's 1530.
Yeah. Quite so.
Mm.
Yeah.
Have you done any study about whether the words which he's chosen to list alphabetically to explain were words that he had coined, or were they words he took from common speech?
A bit of both, Tom. A bit of both. He a mix. It's not a dictionary style of definition always. It's sometimes an encyclopedic explanation of the background of the word. And sometimes he makes it quite clear that he isn't the creator of the word. He says, for example, as we say, or as they say. And so he's clearly representing something that he's heard in common speech. But some of them are so unusual that he has to explain them, as he says. People will not understand this unless I tell. So I think it's a mix of the two.
Did he have any tendency to transliterate Hebrew words into English or Greek words into English?
Transliterate. Yes, there are a few cases where you actually do get a Hebrew word that he represents as closely as he can. But on the whole, no.
Of course, in language generally, when somebody's translating, they have a difficult word, they will often do that. Baptism, for example, baptizo from the Greek. The word Messiah in English probably is based on Hebrew.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Well, here we are now. You see, we've got obviously some very common words that were in the language before, like tabernacle and sanctify and words like that. But then in the Deuteronomy prologue, for example, you get avims, a kind of giant, and the word signifieth crooked, upright, or wicked. Now that's a pretty well exact transliteration from the Hebrew. And there'll be others like that here and there. Zamzumims, for instance. And at the same time, then there are other words which have no reference to an earlier language whatsoever, like peace offering or reconcile. Well, it's like that. So it's a real mix, yeah.
I think we have a question from Emily Burgoyne.
Hello, yes, I really enjoyed that. That was absolutely fascinating to listen to.
Thanks.
It's just fantastic. I just wanted, just going back to talking about the pronunciation, obviously all the sort of the regional differences and accents around this country in particular. But at the time when Tyndale was writing and speaking, was there a kind of a social difference in pronunciation, not just regional? So, today, the minute that somebody speaks in received English, you're kind of immediately thinking, oh, they come from maybe, a certain background. Was that the case when Tyndale was in the 16th century?
No, there was no class difference between accents at that time. There were significant regional differences, but you could have a king or a queen speaking in a very regional kind of way, and nobody would have batted an eyelid, absolutely not normal. The people did insult and mock other accents, but it could go in any direction. So there's a very famous 16th century work written by a man called Putnam, who writes from the south of England, and who does actually say, the best speech is within 60 miles of London. But what he means by best is just, the most familiar and so on. He doesn't really mean upper class or lower class. And he's very critical about the speech, the guttural speech of people from York, which, sounds as if they're being ill all the time. That you get that kind of comment at the time. But it was a comment of one regional variation versus another. The accent that you mentioned that you called received English, that I called received pronunciation just a little while ago, that did not develop until around about the year 1800. It's very, very recent. And it's only in the 19th century that you get this very sharp divide between an upper class accent and a lower class accent, or perhaps I should say an upper class accent and a lower class accent, because the R-A distinction is one of the big differences between those two styles of English. But no, nothing quite like that in Tyndale's time.
Actually, also one more thing. When did when you talked about the fact that as words were written, they were pronounced, so whales and gnashing, why did those sounds start to be sort of phased out? Was that, I don't know, was that to do with the sort of regional or social, again, differences?
Oh, this is a spelling tradition, really. Spelling always takes longer to change than pronunciation. Pronunciation changes just like that, really. Within a generation, people will start to speak slightly differently from the generation before. We tend not to notice it unless we've got relatives, grandchildren, or whatever, or young, teenagers who are speaking differently, and you think, oh, they're speaking in a disgusting way. They've lost it. They've lost the way. Terrible. And that's the sign that pronunciation is shifting. 100 years later, you won't even notice those changes in pronunciation. In the 19th century, a word like balcony was pronounced balcony. And people hated this new pronunciation that was coming in. There would be letters to the Times saying, people are now pronouncing balcony as if it's balcony. It's disgusting. 100 years on, who cares? It's all gone. So pronunciation shifts quite rapidly within a generation or two, and certainly within 100 years. And in Tyndale's time, he was writing just in the middle of a big pronunciation shift. It was called in linguistics the Great Vowel Shift. And it's called that because all the long vowels in English, E, A, E, O, U, all of those shifted their pronunciation within 2 generations. So Chaucer and his grandchildren would have had difficulty understanding each other. And it was still repercussing through into the 16th century, these changes. So within 100 years, and definitely within 150 years, the pronunciation of English had shifted from Chaucer's time to something much more like the present day. But the spelling didn't shift. That was the thing. People were so used to writing gnashing with a G and answered with a W and so on, that they just kept on doing so, even though those sounds had died away. Why did they die away? Because of all sorts of reasons. But yeah, some of them, they're difficult to pronounce, and swur. What? Swur in the middle of a word? Ooh, no, answer. Gonna. How many words in English begin with gonna? It's not a natural English pronunciation, even though it was in Anglo-Saxon. Some foreign languages these days, no problem at all. But English, for all sorts of reasons, started to drop some of these complex consonant clusters. And that, along with the vowel change, meant that, a word like name, pronounced name, is spelled how? N-A-M-E. Why isn't it spelled N-E or something, pronounced like a name? Because in Chaucer's time it was pronounced Nama, name, Nama. The vowel shift comes along, Nam becomes nam, becomes nam, becomes name, becomes name, becomes name over 400 years. But the pronunciation changes, but the spelling stays the same. And so it's this gradual mismatch between spelling and pronunciation that was so noticed in the 16th century, to the extent that, as I mentioned in the talk, people then began to write books on it. The spelling reform movement began. Let's get back to simple spelling, they would say in the 16th century. And that movement, of course, is still going on today. There is still a spelling reform society in Britain and in America. And people would love to try and reconstruct a simpler spelling system for English. They'll never be able to do it simply because there's 500, 600 years of tradition that you can't get away from.
As a frustrated student of French, I always bothered with all the consonants and vowels that weren't pronounced in learning French.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I think your last comment leads naturally to tell people that you have fabulous talks about, is there a future to the English language, right there on the podcast, right?
Well, that's been probably the most popular topic of the last, 20 years or so, indeed. Indeed, future of English, or the future of Englishes, as is the more common parlance these days, at least in the more popular journals.
Well, the reason I say that is because we would love to, I don't want to abuse the privilege of your being with us. We have absolutely enjoyed your presence and your thoughts, and I think everybody's going to go out and buy your books, as a matter of fact, and probably invite you to more talks. So,
I have a question if there's still time.
Okay.
So tell me, Professor, if we look at Tyndale in the archaic spelling, every time we see an E at the end of a word, should that E be pronounced? Like in the beginning, or where do we go with the E?
Yeah, not in Tyndale's time. In Chaucer's time, yes. And there's quite a debate in the scholarly literature about just how much of that dropping of the E was around in Chaucer's time. The consensus is that it was still being pronounced, but it was beginning to die away. And the evidence, of course, is once again in the spellings, where some people would spell these words without the E, and that's the evidence you need to show that it was disappearing. But as in the answer to the question a few minutes ago, spelling changes very slowly. And if name was spelt with an E at Chaucer's time, it's going to stay with an E unless, somebody, it's a useful hint that the vowel before it is going to be long. Imagine the two words, N-A-M-E and N-A-M. How are you going to pronounce them? Nam for the second one. Well, you need the E to show that it's going to be nam or name or name or something. That final E in spelling is an absolutely crucial guide to the difference between long vowels and short vowels, even in modern English. But in pronunciation, it died out very, very quickly. And by Tyndale's time, there's no hint of it being there, really. I didn't put any in the pronunciation that I did for the British Library. None at all.
Thank you.
Oh, having said that, some poets, of course, would keep it. Like poets do, that's what poets do. They sort of keep old pronunciations a lot of the time. And you will sometimes, and in French, you were mentioning French before, vive la rose, rose. Oh, no, it's rose. No, rose in song in that case, or certain types of poems and so on and so forth. And sometimes, depending on the meter, it's useful to have an E pronounced. Shakespeare sometimes does it, banished. But in Romeo and Juliet, you get also not just banished, but banished with the E pronounced at the end. So there is always a bit of variation in the language, and even today you'll find the odd example of it. But as a regular thing, out it went.
All right. So
Can I,
yep, go
sorry,
ahead.
can I ask one quick question?
Yes.
How should we be pronouncing his name? Is it Tyndale or Tyndall?
Very good question. And the cheeky answer is no idea. Because proper names, as I hinted at the very beginning of the talk, are unpredictable. How do you pronounce anybody's name? It's up to them, really. It's up to them. So you get famous cases, don't you, in certainly in British history, of a word like it looks like Cholmondeley, but it's actually pronounced Chumley, you know. And there are so many examples of a proper name not being pronounced. It's another class thing, you know. I'm upper class and you'll pronounce the name the way I want you to pronounce it, you know. And so you'll get all these variations all over the place. Spelling will not be a good guide here because, you know, the spelling of your name is part of your identity and you're not going to mess with it. Having said that, there are examples in the Tyndale period of his name being spelt, for example, with a double L at the end. And so that would suggest Tyndall. And then there are examples with the spelling that we know today, which suggests the opposite. So it's the same with Shakespeare. You know, Shakespeare has something like 20 or so different spellings of his name. It was probably Shakespeare originally, Shakespeare. But, you know, who knows really? I mean, the point is uncertain. But yeah, I guess he'd have said Tyndall a lot of the time. I think that's my guess.
So how many languages do you know, Professor Crystal? David?
What does one mean by no?
Or language?
Enough to buy a beer in is a very different question from being able to give a lecture in.
I see.
And when you do linguistics, you do lots of languages to a certain level and no further. I used to run a course at Reading University called Language Practical, where you would bring in a student or a member of staff who comes from a different part of the world, speaks a language that nobody knows, you know, like Swahili or something like that. You'd sit them down in front of the class, and the aim of the exercise is to speak their language. The principle is that the person is allowed to understand English, but is not allowed to speak it. So you start off your class and say, what do you call this? And we'll point to a table, and the fellow says table in his language. What do you call that? What do you call it? And you start to build up a vocabulary, and slowly a few basic phrases. And of course, you have to get the pronunciation right. He'll correct your pronunciation. Within 10 hours, assuming you've got the right skill background, it's possible to have a basic conversation with this guy. The vocabulary will be very limited, but it's possible to do it. I've done, I don't know, 30, 40 languages like that. Are they in my head now? They've probably gone. But yet I'd like to think that if I went to that part of the world, it would dredge up again in some way. As far as more fluent languages are concerned, well, I do my best with English, as you've heard. I'm in Wales. Welsh is my second language. I was brought up here, even though I didn't live here for many years.
Right.
And I have given a lecture in French once upon a time, but I don't think I'd like to do it now. And I could order a gin and tonic in Spanish and Portuguese and a few other languages, I suspect. But again, don't ask me to have a serious conversation afterwards. So it's a varied answer.
Thank you.